All right. Well, hello, everyone. Great to see you all today and great to have you on this really important discussion, which really we need to be talking much more on. But the discussion today is mental health at work, proactive or reactive. I have the great pleasure, again, to be joined by gracious Musariri, and I'll let you say your hellos.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Thanks Roy for having me again. I'm Gracious and I'm the founder of Empylo, which is an employee wellbeing consultancy offering assessments, wellbeing assessments and talks on mental health in the workplace. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about, Roy and I kind of had a discussion, a conversation, and we thought it would be really interesting to look at how proactive well-being in the workplace how we can be more proactive about well-being in the workplace. So yeah, really excited and thank you for joining us.
Super. Thank you so much, Gracious. Would you like to tell everyone a little bit more about your background with Empylo and what that's all about for people who don't know about it?
Yeah, so I'm a mental health nurse practitioner by background, worked in the NHS for 8+ years. And from my experience working in the NHS, I've come across a lot of kind of people coming into services, having experienced kind of work-related mental ill health. So from my early career, I started to identify the relationship between workplace well-being and kind of just general mental health in general. So since then, I've kind of started researching and then developed Empylo or founded Empylo, which started as a community, just sharing information and knowledge about well-being and mental health. And now we've kind of moved into a consultancy, which I do part-time as I'm still working in the NHS as well. And also kind of just looking to build relationships with clients and with people as well. So that's effectively where we're at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gracious. And lovely to have you with us, Claire. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Roy Magara, and I own and run my own employment law firm, which is Magara Law. Based in Bicester, got offices in Banbury and London now, but we do act for clients nationwide. This is not going to be a legal lecture, you'll be glad to know. This is going to be very much a discussion on a really important topic, and it's got to be interactive. So you guys are welcome to unmute yourselves, raise your hand, use the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with, but please, please, please join part of this really important discussion. So let's dive in. The first thing that we're going to talk about are the objectives. I'm going to just hand over to Gracious for a quick moment, outline what we're going to be doing, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be quite nice to start with just saying how we are today. I think it's a nice way to just check in and to kind of have everyone kind of relaxed and be interactive. So I'll start with myself. If you want to enter in the chat, feel free to say how you're kind of presenting today or how you're feeling. So as I said, I'm Gracious and I'm coming here feeling a little bit nervous. I always get a bit nervous before talks, but it definitely helps me to kind of execute the talk in the best way I can, but also very excited and looking forward to have this talk. Over to anybody who would like to share, or if you'd like to share in the chat, that would be really nice. So just give a few minutes for that. Now, Roy, do you want to go ahead?
Gladly. So hello again, everyone. How am I feeling today? I'm feeling like I got my to-do list sort of shouting at me in the back of my head, but I am endeavoring and I'm really actually do my best to be present, because I think that's really important. It's really easy, I think, for many of us to feel that way, but actually being present gives me the best enjoyment of the situation that I'm in. So that's how I'm feeling right now.
Great, thank you, Roy. And Claire, we can see feeling good, productive week, and nearly the weekend. So happy Thursday, everyone.
Do you want me to? Okay, so I will be very honest, and I'm feeling very anxious today. So I should have said before that I suffered with mental health in my 20s and in my late 30s, with an eating disorder and then with depression. And one thing that I've learned through coping and dealing with it is that you need to admit how you are. And today I'm feeling slightly anxious about the future, with a number of reasons behind it. But if you ask me, not just here, but anywhere, how I'm feeling, I will be very honest and I'll tell you how I'm feeling, because that's one of the first things that I learned I had to admit to myself and everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.
But you will not know because I'm always smiling.
That you are.
Thank you for sharing, Plessy, and that's really important to share, I think, with everyone, that it's a good starting point to share how you're feeling and be honest. So thank you. Happy to stay on and chat if you want to chat afterwards as well, just to have a talk. So thank you. And then in the comments we've got Diane said, interested in the session, have had a long walk with my dog this morning, very nice, which always sets me up well for the day. So that's really good to know. So thank you, Diane, and hope the walk was pleasant, no rain from your end where you are. And Andrea, feeling tired following an extended day spent with Newcastle, moving my daughter into a new digs yesterday. Congratulations to your daughter. But looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say on this session. Thank you, Andrea. Great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing, and feel free to keep adding as we go. And thank you, Hannah. I've just seen yours. Feeling a bit under pressure from employment deadlines, but generally positive. Yep. The deadlines are always one of the reasons what causes kind of pressure and kind of stress in the workplace. So I completely relate to that, Hannah. And I hope you're finding a way to work through the deadlines, and hopefully this session might help you as well to think of ways to do that. So glad that you're generally positive as well. Great. So to get started, as Roy said, just highlighting or going over our objectives for this session. The aims for today are essentially to highlight, discuss, and offer. So the first thing we want to do is highlight the importance of proactively managing mental health at work. Why is it important? So myself and Roy will be kind of going over that with you, and then happy for your input as well. And then the second part we want to be able to discuss. So discuss what are the employers or companies and businesses obligations from a legal and ethical perspective, and just kind of looking at that. I think Roy will be sharing some case studies, which I'm really interested to hear about and to learn from as well. And then lastly, we'll offer some proactive approaches to managing mental health at work from kind of a business and employer perspective. So thank you. Looking forward to that. On to the next slide, Roy.
Thank you. Then over to me. I will deal with all the exciting stuff from a legal point of view. And so for this particular session, we'll just be focusing on what happens when companies aren't proactive. But before we go into that, I think it's best to start with what actually are the legal obligations that are placed on employers when it comes to mental health. And it may or may not be surprising to people, actually. It might actually be disheartening for some to actually figure out that the law doesn't require employers to do that much in terms of actively protecting employees against or supporting them with mental health. In the UK at the moment, there are two legal requirements which are very clear, and I've put them on the slide as you can see there. The first, in terms of a blanket rule, employers shouldn't be discriminating against any employee or applicant with a mental health condition that qualifies as a disability under the Equality Act. And I'll break that up into a bit more detail in a moment in terms of what all of that means. And then secondly is with regard specifically to stress at work, where employers are obliged to conduct a risk assessment for stress at work and take action based on those findings. That's it. Everything else is just fair game for employers to try and figure out on their own. And while there are some areas of mental health in which employers have got some kind of governmental guidelines in terms of what's called a duty of care, and I'm not going to spend much time on that at all, this is not a legal lecture, but what I will be doing is helping us understand that in fact what employers do need to do is we need to fill in the gaps with our own intuition and our own initiative as well. Now, let's look at those particular two areas in a bit more succinct detail. So to begin with, where employers aren't allowed to discriminate against any employee or applicant with a mental health condition, that's got to classify as a disability under the Equality Act. And in short, actually, I will add as well, that also includes employers being obliged to ensure that they make reasonable adjustments for their employees. And in this context, for those who've got a mental health condition. And the key word here is reasonable. there are many instances where an employee may think that an employer has got to move the world, as it were, because of a particular condition that they may have. But an employer has only got to do so as long as it's within their means and administrative capabilities. But what do I mean when I say that it qualifies as a disability under the Equality Act? Well, simply put, it's got to have a substantial and long-term adverse effect on an individual's normal day-to-day activities. So it's got to go beyond the sort of normal capabilities that one person can do in comparison to another. It's got to affect their sort of normal day-to-day, regular, average Joe activities or interactions with others. Now, as we may know, and we've talked about this already in different capacities when we looked at highlighting how we're feeling earlier, there are different types of mental health conditions. In my work, a lot of what I see at the moment are anxiety, depression, eating disorders, schizophrenia, and a lot of these are off the back of issues that have happened from work, whether it's toxic cultures, whether it's bullying in the workplace. All of these things have eventually caused the anxiety and depression. And of course, these things can be caused through for many other reasons as well. But in the context of this particular discussion, a lot of my clients have that as a consequence of that kind of history. And a lot of these clients end up on all manner of antidepressants, or may need CBT, or other ways of therapies, and in order to try and help them manage their mental health conditions. It's worth stating at this point that having one of these conditions doesn't automatically mean that a person has a disability under the Equality Act, because that particular condition has got to last, or be seen to last, at least 12 months or more. So moving on from that and looking at the second legal obligation there in terms of employers being obliged to conduct a risk assessment. So to put that into practice, what the law at least assists with at the moment are things like allowing employees to opt out of a 48-hour week, making it a statutory minimum in terms of ensuring that employers take relevant annual leave, take their statutory breaks. But in the context of mental health, what that actually looks like is an employer making sure that steps are taken to prevent people from unreasonable levels of stress. That's the general overview of that particular point. But let's look at the stats, because we have these two clear guidelines, obligations for companies. But when we look at the stats, they can be, at least to me, quite disheartening. The stats here show that 52% of employees are experiencing symptoms of depression. And I think, as Plasty mentioned earlier, there is the stereotypical view of what people think people with depression have, which is looking sad, looking low. And indeed, people with depression or symptoms of depression might indeed come across that way. But in actual fact, and when we look at studies of men and indeed women, but more so men, and in suicide cases, say for example, depression kind of cases, most of them looked happy, were smiling, you never saw it coming. And it's about us getting out of this stereotype of what we think mental health looks like and what mental health actually looks like. In fact, mental health looks like people smiling every day, laughing, joking, but you need to kind of get under the hood of the car, as it were. You need to actually start having much more proactive conversations with people, as opposed to the iceberg surface, how are you, how was your weekend, that's it, crack on with work, particularly if you're in a managerial position. But we'll talk about what proactive looks like a bit later on. Next, in terms of the stats, we see that 61% of employees experiencing depression are female. Now, I'm going to qualify that with what I said earlier. Men stereotypically are less likely to say, hey, I've got a problem, never mind, hello, I've got a mental health condition like depression. So it's quite likely that women are much more forward in terms of asking for help or stating that they have a particular mental health condition, as opposed to men. But we see here quite strikingly about a third of employees experiencing depression are aged 25 to 35. Before I kind of move on, Diane, I know you mentioned that you're in the mental health space. You may or may not have something to say on this. Have you got any thoughts on this or any of these stats?
other than they seem quite familiar, I've sort of read a number of the Deloitte reports, which absolutely, yes, talk about these, and also the fact that you're talking about the female figures and women perhaps being more able to express their views, but also the majority of those who take their own lives tend to be men. So there is that, knowing about the sort of female figures here, but also being hugely aware of the situation with men, and that the large majority of those who take their own lives are men, and that is often because they've not been unable to speak, or because of the culture around traditional thoughts around how men should present and be strong, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, quite right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And indeed, if anyone wants to share anything at any point, just raise your hand or put something in the chat box, and I'll search you out, or Gracious will search you out. That's absolutely fine. Next, just kind of using a quick snapshot at some of the other stats we've got here. 9% of employees are currently seeking mental health support. That to me is really shocking, considering that you've got over half of the workforce who are saying, and that's just depression alone, never mind all the other breadth of mental health that's out there. Only 9%. Gosh, that's low. And if only we could make a positive change and see that number grow, that can have a real positive effect on some of these other stats that we see here. Because the reality is 53% of employees say that bosses don't care about their well-being. That's staggering. That is a real problem. But you know what? I'm not trying to do myself out of a job here, but if we can change the thought process and attitudes of people, I will happily do without that in terms of my work. Because as I say, probably about 2 out of every 3 clients I have, 2 have definitely got some kind of mental health condition because of something that's happened from work, never mind anything else that can happen in life or upbringing or anything else. That's staggering. And Claire, you've put in the chat box here that indeed you've noted some particular legislation here, the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work indeed talk about that a risk assessment must be done. However, most don't. Yeah, I see that quite a lot in my work too. Definitely an occupational hazard, for want of a pun. So now that we've looked at the stats, I'm going to give a case study, which to me was quite staggering, fairly recent too, and then I'm going to pass on to Gracious. What exactly happens when companies aren't proactive? Well, the kind of general rule I can just say is that they're not speaking to an employment lawyer, no doubt. But all that kind of legal stuff aside, we've got to realize, and why employment law to me is something that's quite poignant, is that our employment affects our everyday. What goes on at work, we take home. We take into our relationships, to our children, to our friends, to our families, to our internal talk. It can really affect us. And when we're in highly stressful environments, when we're in toxic cultures, when we're in places that simply aren't doing us any good, that doesn't just negatively impact us, that negatively impacts those around us. And this particular case of Hurl, London Fire Commissioner, is a real example of how when employers are proactive about mental health, this is what can happen. So to give everyone, again, it's not going to be a legal lecture, but I do want to kind of flesh this out a bit more to give you a real example of what actually happened. So Mr. Hurl started off as a fire station manager for the London Brigade in 2019. In February, he actually applied for an urgent transfer to a station closer to his home because the commute was a number of hours away. He cited personal reasons, which he said, quote, caused him much distress, both concerning his wife's mental health and also his daughter's mental health. So never mind his own, he's already trying to juggle 2 other people in a close nexus as well. Soon after him applying for that and citing his daughter's and his wife's mental health, he was also diagnosed by his own GP with depression, and he was prescribed medication as well for that. He, in direct contrast to some of the stats we've seen, had informed his line manager about all of the aforementioned. And his line manager, Claire, had asked him to fill out a stress risk assessment. There we are. So Mr. Hurl had disclosed he was really stressed stressed out about the mental health of his wife and his daughter. He mentioned that as a result of that, he was suffering inadequate sleep due to his worries about the future. His commute, by the way, meant that he had to start at 4:15 a.m. every single day. Yeah, exactly. And so credit to his employer, they did refer him to occupational health. Now, Mr. Hurl during this time had requested some reasonable adjustments, which included a phased return to work after a short term of sick leave, and then transfer to a closer station in the long term. And there was one available at the time, but his employer said, no, you can't have that particular one. The occupational health report suggested supported rather an immediate transfer, because quite evidently the long commute, particularly starting at 4:15 a.m. for anyone, was having a detrimental effect on his mental health. He was signed off sick. He still endeavored to turn up to periodic meetings with occupational health, and then he heard of a vacancy much closer to home, which he applied for, and he was told, sorry, you can't have that because you haven't been here for long enough. And never mind the fact that this ought to have been seen as a reasonable request, as a reasonable adjustment rather, as opposed to some kind of long overdue internal system, he was told no. And he was told that his circumstances weren't exceptional enough. Then, to make matters even worse, Mr. Hurl was then invited to a disciplinary procedure to admit to the offence of having an unacceptable record of attendance. And on the face of it, it was 104 working days lost out of a possible 140. But we've got to bear in mind that this is in direct result to everything that I've just mentioned in terms of the background. And he was subsequently dismissed in October of the same year that he was hired. Now, he then brings a claim against his employer on a number of grounds, but also including discrimination based on his disabilities and for failure to make reasonable adjustments. And he won those particular claims, unsurprisingly somewhat. The employment tribunal had stated that the employer's practice, this internal practice of not transferring employees when it's quite clear that there is a reasonable adjustment need, as opposed to it just being a matter of internal standard, put him quite clearly at a disadvantage in comparison to someone who didn't have his mental health condition. And the employment tribunal, rightly, also stated that calling his absence an offence was definitely quite a sign of the employer's mindset at the time of not considering his mental health as a priority. Because again, his sick leave was as a direct result of the employer's behavior. Equally, the employment tribunal saw that they had discriminated against Mr. Hurl when they had brought the disciplinary proceedings and dismissed him as well. No matter how much the employer said, well, listen, it was because of we were justified, we had to cover his work, we had to provide a safe service to the public, we had to take care of other people's workloads. While it could have been seen that these were objective aims, they weren't proportionate in the circumstances. So what does this remind us employers? Well, it reminds employers, at least, that it can be very difficult to justify denying adjustments for a disabled employee. Employers should be able to show that they have at least considered proposed adjustments. They hadn't considered the occupational health report. They hadn't considered getting in touch with his GP. They hadn't considered having any sensible conversation with Mr. Hurl. But what they had done proactively is bring disciplinary proceedings against him. And what they had done proactively is dismiss him as well. And that, quite rightly so, was seen as discriminatory action. And one can think that this particular scenario with Mr. Hurl is so out there and probably Daily Mail worthy. But in actual fact, I see this month on month. This is a really common scenario where employers say, and I quote one particular employer who told his employee, mental health, that's a fad, get on with it. And eventually dismissed the employee. And that's really, really disappointing to hear. You're very welcome, Dawn. Lovely to see you there. So I'm going to pause on my part. But before I do, before I pass it to Gracious, has anyone got anything to say on anything I've just mentioned? Nope, shaking of heads, which is absolutely fine. If you do want to say anything, put it in the chat box. But for now, and I'm conscious of time too, I'm going to pass on to Gracious. Over to you.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks for that kind of insightful case study there, just highlighting what you said, I guess, happens almost on a daily basis. Some we hear about, some we don't hear about because some people don't, things aren't done about it. So it's interesting to hear that and the outcome of that. So I'll be speaking about why it's important to kind of be proactive about mental health in the workplace. As Roy has just mentioned, that there's other implications such as legal implications for the employer. But the most important one that I say is the sheer increase in mental health and the impact that this has on people. People who are working, people who, their families, as Roy mentioned, there's extended people that we're thinking about, not just the employee directly. So there's facts and the stats that Roy had already shared, which kind of just highlight how impactful mental health is and the different, ways it's impacting people. And then we're thinking about more of the current events, such as post-pandemic. That's definitely had an impact on mental health and the way we work. And also just thinking about, the changes in the work environment, the future of work. People are working in hybrid situations. More and more people are working from home remotely, which is a new way of working, and it's going to impact people in different ways. And then we're also thinking about the current financial situation. We're fast approaching a recession if we're not already in one. What impact is that having on people in terms of their home life, their social life, their financial well-being, as well as their well-being at work, and even just how they're working and how their employers kind of relating to them, their ability to, to earn more or even kind of receive rewards for their work from their workplace. All of that would have an impact. And then we're thinking about, it's important because employers have a duty of care, as Rory mentioned. This is stated clearly as Claire also mentioned, in the Health and Safety at Work Act. As an employer, you would have a duty of care to your employees to support them and to complete certain assessments, risk assessments, to ensure that you are providing the right care and support for your employees. And then we're thinking about the legal and regulatory implications. Roy already kind of touched on this. So we've got the Equality Act 2010, which identifies mental health as a kind of protected characteristic, as well as a disability that employers need to take action for. And then we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act again, which is a regulatory framework, which also highlights mental health and identifies mental health as something that needs to be taken care of by employers, or something that employers need to have provisions for. And then even in a report which was written, there are upcoming or potential legal implications that might be kind of in our future or in the near future. There's changes happening. There's a Stevenson and Farmer review, which was conducted in 2017, where they conducted a review of UK workforces, the UK workforce and workplaces. And one of the recommendations they made was for the government to consider legislative change to enhance protection for employees with mental health conditions. So that's already looking at what more can we be doing, or what more can the government be doing to make sure that employers are providing the right care for their employees and the right support. And then there's also, for the business, from a business perspective, financial and commercial implications. If you're a company, you can see the impact that poor mental health in the workplace can have. Lost days in work. There's a report which states that companies, or the UK in general, loses up to £42 billion, and that's in sickness days, people not being able to turn up to work or attend work because their mental health is compromised. And that has financial implications on the business, as well as just the general population and society. And then commercial implications, there's risks for businesses when you look at things like, customer relationships. What relationships will you have with customers, or your employees? What relationships will they have with customers if they're not happy at work, or they're not healthy and able to work at their best? Productivity, engagement in the workplace. There's so many implications that this can have. I think you may have read a recent story which was in the news and also had an implication. Deloitte, there was a story about Oliver Bredsky, a 21-year-old which was publicized because it was, you know, related to mental health in the workplace. And Deloitte, a trainee at Deloitte, he'd been experiencing mental health concerns. There were clear indications that, you know, he was experiencing mental health concerns. And then he unfortunately was dismissed via a Zoom call. And then immediately after that, he took his own life. And then there was kind of, you know, a lot of publicity around that, a lot of kind of questions and an inquest into that. Why was he not provided with the right support, and why didn't the company do more? So there were kind of implications for the business, as well as, of course, notwithstanding the fact that someone had lost their life and that, you know, the right appropriate action wasn't taken. So if we're moving on to the next slide, Roy. And please feel free to add any comments. I can see Claire also commented saying it frustrates me that situations like this happen when employers should have done risk assessments before people becoming ill and stressed, not after. Would do allow people to break a leg and then treat them. Would not allow people to break a leg and then treat them. The law on health and safety is the same for all risks, and that's true. There should be provisions in the workplace to make sure we're preventing rather than treating, and that's always the best approach. And then Andrea, organizations don't yet fully understand or have awareness of psychosocial risks, and in my experience are reluctant to even admit that they could present potential risks through the work settings. And that's again also very true. Relating to the case study Roy shared, a lot of the mental health experiences and concerns were related to his experiences at work and conditions in the workplace. So again, being able to understand that and accept that as organizations. Okay, and then what should employers aim for in the workplace? And this is again looking at it from a whole company approach and a high level approach. And I think it's all about really, if it's companies that haven't really got anything for mental health or any provisions for mental health, it's thinking about strategizing and having a plan in place, and a plan that is communicated with employees so that employees know where they stand. I think the first step is to have a clear definition of what mental health support looks like in your workplace. So if I'm a HR leader or if I'm a senior leader in the company, I want to be able to look at exactly what does good well-being look like, or positive well-being look like in an organization or in my organization. And there's strategic, you know, and again, if there's strategic plans for sales, there can be strategic plans for well-being. And I think it should be looked at as a strategic priority, and it should be treated in the same way. So even thinking about assessments such as SWOT analysis to look at what are our current strengths in the company in terms of what are the provisions that we've got that are supporting supporting employees' well-being, what are our current weaknesses, identifying where we're going wrong as a company, what could we be doing better, and then opportunities, what is it that we can leverage on to be able to support our employees. And then looking at, again, the threats, what would happen if we don't provide positive mental health or we don't provide support for our employees in order to predict and then prevent anything happening before it happens from a strategic point of view. And then once we understand, also understanding obligations, having that external support, looking at kind of resources that are available online. ACAS, they have a lot of resources on what are employers' obligations and companies' obligations. CIPD, there's a lot of information there. The Equality Act, legal frameworks, again, they're there to provide guidance for employers and for companies. And again, just to mention external support, someone like Roy will be able to provide information on what are the legal obligations for companies, and in a preventative way to make sure that employers know what their obligations are and what they are responsible for. And then taking a planned approach to mental health at work, having a plan in place, a plan that's communicated to employees so that employees know where to access support, who to speak to, and what can be done and what's available to them. And again, culture, we see this coming up a lot in terms of just speaking about mental health and work. Culture is important because the culture directs how the organization responds to initiatives. You could have great initiatives, but if you have a culture that doesn't appreciate those initiatives or that doesn't support those initiatives, then you may as well not have any mental health at work or well-being initiatives in the workplace. There's a great, as a case study, there's also Thames Water, which there was a big turnaround in the culture, which provided better well-being experiences for the employees. Carl Simons, he came in as head of health and safety at work several years ago. I think it was around 2017 or 2018, and he basically made a shift in terms of the well-being. There'd been a lot of accidents, a lot of issues and concerns about employees' well-being. And he said that he was going to focus on culture, on shifting the culture within the workplace as a starting point. And he named the strategy a culture of care, or promoting a culture of care at Thames Water. And in that, there were initiatives and campaigns which really focused on shifting how people spoke about well-being at work and spoke about the workplace in general and felt about well-being, their workplace, and encouraging more openness in the workplace, talking and having open discussions. And again, going back to what we're saying from the start, the beginning of the conversation, when we said it's important to talk about how you're feeling and to be open, because that's already a starting point. And if everyone can be more open about their experiences or what's working well, what's not, then it already starts to create that space where people can start to feel positive about sharing their experiences, and seeking out the opportunities and the support that's there in the workplace in an open way. Next slide, thanks, Roy. And then again, just looking at proactive approaches, this is also not very granular. This is very high level, looking at it from a strategic point of view as a company. What can they implement? And then, of course, within all of these approaches, there's more granular level, things that can be done, such as risk assessments and practical tools that can be developed. But this is looking at it from a high level. And I think the first thing that I would say is assessment and measuring well-being. I am a strong believer of well-being being measurable. I think well-being is measurable, and we do it every day. When you're working in the NHS, you're providing and conducting assessments, well-being, mental health assessments, all of these things, and they feed into our understanding on a personal level of how somebody is or what their needs are. There's no way you can just extract a well-being policy or just from the internet or just put an umbrella policy, but you need to be able to really understand and measure what's going on within your workplace. So this is external assessments, this is, providing even questionnaires and getting feedback from your employees and from your team in order to really understand where they stand in terms of their well-being, what are their needs as well. And then we're looking at mental health policies, having a policy in the workplace. I think Roy and we spoke about this before, and I think you said quite frequently, companies will ask, can we have a mental health policy in the workplace? We don't have anything. A policy is great because, anyone working in HR will know that there's policies for recruitment, policies for, sickness, all of these things. But I think a separate and specific mental health policy is really important as a guiding tool for employers. As a company, if you are a leader and you are, a senior manager in the workplace, or you're implementing things in the workplace, you want to have a guiding tool that supports your thinking and supports what you do and what you're implementing. And then even for employees, they need a policy. They want to be able to know what's available to them, what support is there, and what to do in an instance or situation where they feel that they're unwell. And a policy just helps people to really understand how your organization works, what provisions are there for employees, and what your organization promises to do for employees. And then also thinking about well-being strategy and budget. It depends on the size of the company, but again, well-being is a priority, and it should be a strategic priority, and something such as well-being should have a strategy in place where employers are planning, linking again to policies. Employers are planning for well-being and having provisions in place, initiatives, campaigns, communications, whatever it may be, And most of the time that does need a budget. There should be a budget allocated to employee well-being, whether it's providing training to employers, mental health first aider training for employers, well-being days, whatever it may be. There should be money and budgets allocated to well-being, as important as it is to, you know, bring in customers or take customers out for meals because it's bringing in sales. Well-being should be the same, if not more important, because if your employees are not well and they're, you know, not feeling safe and positive in the workplace, then what else? Nothing else really matters. So that should also be a starting point, and there should be more money and budgets going towards employees and supporting employees in the workplace. And then again, training. Training is important, and it can come in the form of consulting. It can come in the form of, you know, mental health at work training, mental health first aid training, mental health at work talks. I think Diana was saying, you know, providing talks and being able to speak to employers, managers, again, not managers from a senior level, but even line managers. They deal with a lot of complexities. You know, they're dealing with so many various things, and mental well-being is probably something they're not very educated on, or that they fear, and they don't know how to address or approach well-being. I think a lot of feedback that I've had from conversations and interactions with even people I've worked with and clients is, you know, managers don't know how to respond when somebody tells them, you know, I'm feeling very stressed and you know, something is wrong, something mentally, I'm not well, I'm not feeling safe. They don't know how to respond to that. So having training and being able to understand what they can do as a manager, or how they can just start that conversation, is really important as well. And even just training for employees so that they know and understand more about their well-being and about managing mental health, and just promoting well-being in the workplace in general. And then reporting, again, it also very much links to strategy and assessment and policy as well, because I think it's important to be able to measure what you're doing and report what you're doing. So if you are implementing strategies, or if you have initiatives in the workplace, there should be feedback, and you should be able to report on what you're doing and sharing that information with your employees, sharing that information with various stakeholders, so that they see that you're being responsible and, you know, you're doing something proactive for employees to support their well-being. And it just guides as well. Reporting, it gives you a guiding point for what you need to be doing better, or what could be changed, and what's working well and what's not. Okay, and then frameworks, again, I think frameworks, there's various frameworks that are already available. Again, mental health and safety at work, that's a framework that's kind of already there and available. ACAS, they also provide a framework for positive mental health in the workplace. And a framework, again, as we know, is something which also guides us in that we can work against. We personalize it to our, you know, your specific organization, but it's a guiding tool which kind of helps you to think about what you should have in place and what you should be implementing and what's important. And then there's also the ISO 45003 or ISO 45003, which is quite new. It's by IOSH, and it's a framework about promoting and supporting positive psychological well-being in the workplace. And again, it's essentially there to guide employers. It's there to give advice for employers and anybody who has a people management role within the company on how to improve psychological well-being in the workplace. And I'll be happy to kind of share all of these afterwards in an email or in the chat, or if you also have any frameworks that you know of that, or any policies or tools, please also feel free to share with people. And then third-party vendors, again, bringing in people who have expertise in mental health and well-being. You know, it's important to really, I can see some suggestions here: thriving at work core standards, health and safety executive stress risk assessment, really, really useful. So definitely, please look in the comments. There'll be some suggestions there that you can definitely use or read up on. And again, as I was saying, third-party vendors, again, bringing in people with specific expertise. We don't expect HR to know everything in the workplace. There are specific roles within the company. There are people who will have interest in mental health and will want to talk about well-being in the workplace. And this is where champions are developed. but there's also specific companies that will provide training, specific companies that will provide consulting, will help develop well-being strategies. We know that time is, of the essence, and people don't always have, and some of the reasons why companies don't always have strategies or things that in place is because they don't have the time or they don't have the skills and tools. So being able to use external vendors and companies is really important, and being able to kind of search them out and kind of leverage on that support that's available. And then lastly, before I read Hannah's comment, networks and alliances. There's a growing space of networks and alliances for employers, as well as anyone who's just interested in well-being in the workplace and who might be somebody in the workspace, in the well-being field and space. Certain number of networks that are available. I'll share some now. There's the City Mental Health Alliance. You can join. In that, you'll be able to find resources, toolkits, for example, guides on how to start implementing or assessing workplace well-being in the workplace. There's also the Global Business Collaboration for better workplace mental health. And this was recently incorporated, I think earlier this year actually, and it's a group of companies coming together with an agenda, with the same common goal, which is to improve well-being in the workplace, sharing ideas, building a community. People are pledging. I think they've got 1.6 million people, employees, who have pledged to well-being in the workplace. And this just highlights how much is needed. And it's a growing number, over 100 companies that have signed up. And these are kind of small to large companies. I think Deloitte might be one of the companies. So it's just great to look at what these alliances offer. There'll be tools, resources available to kind of use within your own teams or companies. mentalhealthatwork.org. Again, plenty of resources there. It's a network that shares news updates. It's always good to kind of keep track with what the updates are in the space of workplace well-being, any change in regulations, that kind of thing. It's always good to be there. And then joining communities. There are communities where you just join, sign up, and you get updates, news, being able to speak to people about experiences. This can be for employees as well as employers, a place to share and to learn from others as well. And again, any other alliances that are there, this is a space to share information. So please do drop them in the chat, or anywhere, anything that you've heard of that's really good, because I know there's plenty of resources and alliances and networks out there for people. And I can see here some comments coming in. So I'll start reading the comments. I think we're from Hannah. So conversely, my current employer is fantastic with my mental health, and my line manager will regularly call me up just to see how I am and if I need any help, and sometimes just for a chat about non-work stuff. She's great. I think that's really positive, and it's nice to hear that people are taking that approach, and people do feel supported. So that's really good news, Hannah. And I think and hope more and more managers feel comfortable to have conversations and to take this approach in the workplace and to support their teams and colleagues. And then Dawn, I have an experience in the workplace that has impacted my mental health. I have experienced workplace bullying, racial trauma, sexual assault and workplace injuries, emotional and psychological abuse, all occurred in the workplace from manager, union and employees. And again, you can see the contrast from kind of Hannah's positive message and then Dawn's experience where it's not positive. And there's all of these things that encompass into one causing mental health, ill health in somebody or impacting somebody's well-being. So many things can go into this: bullying, trauma, injuries, all of these things to be considered. And that just highlights again how complex mental health is and the different things that can contribute to mental ill health and impact us. So thank you for sharing that, Dawn. And again, lessons to be learned from that, and even coming from managers, unions and other employees, we can all have impacts on one another. And I think this is where culture again comes in, because certain things, if it's a culture where people aren't able to care for one another, or people aren't supportive, or that doesn't promote well-being, this is where you start to see abuse and you start to see these kind of things kind of transpire and continue. And that's where I think where we need to think about culture. Andrea, many managers or leaders do not have the skills that are often equipped to know how to deal with an employee reporting. Completely agreed. Mental health and stress, and they just refer on to EAP, Employee Assistance Program. Good to hear that Hannah is getting the right support from a manager, but I feel these are few and far between. Also completely agreed. And again, employee assistance programs are there to offer support. However, majority of the time, from my experience, people don't even know how to access employee assistance programs. It might be a number stuck in the staff room or a number somewhere on the intranet. It's not always easily visible. And again, there's that argument, is an EAP reactive? Is it proactive? Because people often seek support from an employee assistance program. And just to give more context, is, you know, having kind of a counseling line that would be considered an employee assistance program. That's usually reactive, and it's usually when somebody is already experiencing a crisis or already in a place where they need an intervention that they would reach out to an employee assistance program. Whereas we're thinking it should be more proactive, and there should be more things to address well-being and mental health early on before it even needs to be an intervention. I'm just mindful of time as I'm reading the comments. But yeah, seeing again, health and safety stress standards, Stevenson Pharma standards, these are all very helpful and available online, and we'll definitely be sharing those for everybody. And then Plessy, she's been reading a lot lately and finding information about positive practices for mental health in the workplace. Although in the last year, we've seen a lot more information available about mental health in the workplace. Still not many employers bringing the conversation live. Practitioners are the ones bringing the conversations live more often than others, but the missing link is HR departments, and especially management and founders. Completely agreed with that. I think one of the things that Carl Simons implemented was mental health should be kind of from a top-down, there should be a top-down approach. If senior managers are talking about well-being and they're being open about well-being, storytelling, sharing the message, that ultimately changes the culture and changes everyone else's view on well-being. But we do find that, you know, HR departments and senior management sometimes in companies aren't really bringing that conversation to the table, and that also just impacts how the rest of the company sees and views well-being and mental health in the workplace. Roy, where are we with time in terms of reading the comments? I can see more comments. Really great to see something.
That's all right. No, keep the comments coming. We've got about 3 minutes, shall I say, to kind of get through these comments, but keep them coming. Or if people want to share something when not muted, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. But you're welcome to keep going through them, Grace.
Okay, great. And thank you everyone for the engagement and for sharing all of this information. I think it'll be very helpful for us all. And just, the book Mental Health at Work by James Routledge is actually on my list of recommendations. Roy, I know you've read that. I'm pretty sure you're looking for it now, so you can show us, aren't you? Yeah, it's a great book. James Routledge, he's the founder of Sanctus, which is a mental health coaching company. And he's kind of he experienced mental health issues and concerns early on in his career as a founder. And then he went on to found the business Sanctus, which provides coaching to companies. And then he's now written a book about his experiences and generally talking about positive case studies and positive, there we go. So that's the book, and I'm sure you'll give us a review. It's really positive and great, isn't it? It's quite helpful.
Quite right. In fact, I got it because Plessy had mentioned it in a post on LinkedIn, and you said, Roy, you got to read this book. And I said, well, if Plessy recommends it, then it's got to be a good book.
Thank you, Plessy, for recommending again. And again, ISO 45003, 45003. And again, that's a comment from Peter. I need to contextualize the role. I think, again, it's still in its early phases of development and kind of release, and I think and hope there'll be more kind of development with the ISO 45003 and how, and even just the publicity on it and communications around it, and for employers to know more about how to use it specifically in their workplaces. Proactive approach is the regulatory position. Again, thank you, Peter. Again, regulation is important. And then again, Palmer and Stevenson, there's a template. That's a really good review. If you want a starting point just to think about mental health in the workplace in the UK, the Stevenson and Farmer review, really, really useful. Some very helpful recommendations in there. And I think I'll hand over back to you, Roy.
Super. Thank you very much, Grace, for working through those. I'll just do the last couple of comments and then Peter, I'm coming over to you.
Yeah.
Cassie, you mentioned, if you think about it this way, we're all born with physical health as well as our mental health, but we don't want to talk about our mental health because it makes us feel vulnerable. So employers absolutely could and should be more proactively engaging to talk about how we are and how we feel. Totally agree with you there. Thank you for those comments, everyone. Peter, over to you.
What I was going to say is, if you're a small business, like you can actually get 45,003 online. You can get a copy of it, but it outlines the principles of what a good psychologically healthy workplace should look like. It's only 34 pages, but it is worth the read, and it gives you 10 elements that we felt were important in promoting psychological health, which is obviously health and well-being, the principles of health and well-being. So yeah, if you don't want to read the 10, just come and chat to me on LinkedIn at 2 o'clock every day, and I'll take you through it. All right then.
Super. Thank you, Peter. On your invitation to get in touch with you via LinkedIn, you're welcome to leave your link for LinkedIn in the chat, and of course anyone else's as well if you'd like to connect. In these last closing minute or two, Diane, I know you asked me a question way back in the comments about any differences in the types of cases that I've seen sort of pre and post pandemic. What I would say about pre-pandemic, there was, I would suggest, definitely a trend in terms of many employees actually being in the wrong or facing some kind of disciplinary, or the lines were blurred in terms of the evidence, who's right and who's wrong. But more often than not, it was employees seeking advice because of something that's gone on and they're put in the frame for it. During the pandemic, lots on redundancies, lots on unfair dismissal, somewhat unsurprisingly. Post-pandemic, I would say I'm actually seeing quite a lot of employees who are evidently in the right, and based on the facts, and employees in terms of mindset are much more passionate about their legal standing than I would suggest they were before. So whereas pre-pandemic it was a lot more, have I been unfairly dismissed or not? Post-pandemic, there's definitely a lot more about discrimination, lots more about mental health than pre-pandemic by any stretch of the imagination. But I would suggest, yeah, discrimination seems to fit the post as opposed to unfair dismissal than pre. So I'll just make a couple of closing comments based on what Grace you mentioned. I thought they were all really good points. Some things I've noted, particularly when we got to the mental health policy, was that, yeah, they're definitely helpful, but they have zero impact if they're not actually put into practice, as you mentioned. And just to highlight that, just some closing points on the fact that managers are human too, and they need support. And we've talked a lot about kind of top-down leadership in that sense and top-down discussions on this, and that's key, but we've got to remember they're human too. I also think that making stereotypically taboo topics that can affect mental health normal, like for example menopause. As an employment lawyer, only last year or the year before did I really kind of think about that a lot more, and that's shocking considering I've been 10 years in practice. But who knew that some symptoms of the menopause can mean that it can affect a woman's mental health? I mean, that we need to kind of join the dots a bit more and see that these things that affect everyday life happen all around us, our moms, our daughters, our sisters, our colleagues at work. It's really important to make that discussion and to bring men in on discussion as well. It's not just a woman thing. It's men need to be involved in these sorts of discussions too. I think you raised really good points on measuring well-being, and also showing employees that both they and their work are valued, and perhaps even having a mental health buddy at work. You don't need to have a condition to have a mental health buddy, but just having that trusted other person whom you can have that time out to discuss things with, I think would be really valuable. These are some of many ways that employers can be really proactive about mental health. It's been really great to have some really sensitive and positive discussion on this topic. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Gracious, a special thank you to you. I'll let you say your goodbyes.
No, thank you. Just echoing what you said, Roy, some really, really important points there at the end. I think really liked what you said about managers are human as well, and kind of thinking about joining the dots. I've written that down because I think that's really important. The complexities of the workplace and how all of that comes together to make a human being or impact a human being. So definitely. Thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement. It's always nice to have feedback, to learn as well in these talks, because we're all kind of trying to learn and develop. So I've learned a lot. There's new things that I've picked up from the chat box and just conversations today. And I really look forward to engaging and talking to you all. Please find me on LinkedIn. It's the same as on screen, Gracious Musariri. And of course, feel free to email me if you want to ask any questions or just to chat about anything. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Roy.
You're very welcome. Do take care, everyone. Have a blessed day. Thank you and goodbye.